You can't go in there, sweetie. Invited guests only. The guard's voice was kind, not stern, the sort of voice adults use when turning away a child from a place meant for older, wiser people. Yet the words drew an invisible line across the ground. Inside that line lay one of the oldest universities in America, proud in its traditions, humming with the morning anticipation of scholars. Outside stood a small girl, no taller than the iron railings that marked the boundary, clutching a paper bouquet to her chest. The autumn sun over Harvard Yard spilled through the elms like honey poured from a jar. Light struck the old brick walls and made them glow, as though centuries of learning had been lit from within. Across the cobblestones, dry leaves stirred and circled, little golden whirlwinds chasing each other, and at the very center of the yard rose a tall blackboard, its dark surface already filled with chalk marks, numbers stretching and clustering like constellations. Professors and students pressed close, murmuring, their voices mingling with the rasp of chalk that rose and fell like the bow of a violin. It was not an ordinary morning. The gathering was for a public challenge, a small ritual of pride that Harvard staged from time to time. Today, the problem written in tall red letters across the board was the Goldbach conjecture, a puzzle older than the nation itself, whispered over for centuries, resisted by every mathematician who had dared. It declared that every even number greater than 2 could be expressed as the sum of 2 primes, elegant, simple, unbroken for more than 280 years. For the crowd, it was an occasion to watch genius at work, or at least to bask in its glow. For the girl at the gate, it was something else entirely. Her name was Lila Thompson. She was 10 years old, born in a Nebraska town where the soil was too dry and the sky too wide. Her father had been lost in a farm accident when she was 5. Her mother, too young and too weary, had drifted away not long after. That left her with May, her grandmother, who carried her to Cambridge in hopes of work and shelter. They lived now in a one-room loft near Porter Square, its windows drafty, its pipes groaning through the winter. Lila had learned early to help in the only way she could. She folded flowers out of colored paper, tied them with twine, and sold them to passers-by. Most mornings she carried a bundle down Massachusetts Avenue, hoping for a few dollars to stretch the heating bill. But this morning her steps slowed when she reached the gates of Harvard. The sound of voices, the thrill of something alive in the air, drew her closer. She pressed her cheek against the cool iron and watched. The guard noticed her and offered his gentle refusal. She nodded, obedient. She would not cross the line. Still, her eyes remained fixed on the numbers. A piece of chalk, snapped short by a hurried hand, rolled off the platform and skittered across the cobblestones until it stopped near her shoes. Lila bent down and picked it up. It was worn thin, no larger than her thumb, but still sharp enough to write. She did not walk to the board. She would never dare. Instead, she crouched on the stone just outside the gate and pressed the chalk to the ground. Slowly, carefully, she drew a circle, uneven yet complete. Inside the circle she wrote, 38 equals 31 plus 7. Then, tilting her head, she whispered to herself, if 31 is here and 7 is there, the sum is like hands of a clock swinging around, a pedal folding back to the center. Her voice was almost lost beneath the hum of the crowd, but her smile was clear. To her, the even numbers were not obstacles to be proven. They were petals of a flower. Each pair of primes curved back toward a hidden heart. Someone nearby noticed. A tall young man, carrying a leather satchel, had been watching the proceedings with little hope. He was a graduate student named Adrian Miller, born in Iowa, drawn east by the promise of Harvard, but often doubting whether he belonged. He looked down at the chalk flower on the ground and felt a jolt, as if the stone beneath his shoes had shifted. He pulled out his phone and snapped a picture. Others passed by without seeing. A professor brushed close, frowning at the child and muttering, "Nonsense. Children's play." But the girl did not hear him. She was busy drawing another circle beside the first, writing 46 equals 43 plus 3, and then tracing a line that joined the primes like a stem meeting a leaf. 2 petals now swaying in the morning air. Inside the yard, the lecture continued. The professor at the board explained the conjecture in measured tones, the way it had been explained thousands of times before. Every even number, he said, could be written as the sum of 2 primes. He sketched examples, simple ones: 4 as 2 plus 2, 6 as 3 plus 3, 8 as 5 plus 3. The crowd nodded, familiar with these beginnings, and waited for a leap that would never come. But Lila was not listening to the lecture. She was seeing the rhythm. 38, 46, 52. With each even number, she imagined 2 points glowing on the circle's edge, then a line drawn between them. Petals fanning outward, spiraling into infinity. The conjecture, to her, was not a wall to climb, but a bloom unfolding. A gust of wind scattered leaves across her chalk circles. The paper flowers in her arms quivered. She pressed them close to her chest, protecting them as though they were alive. The guard looked again, meaning to send her away, but hesitated when he saw the concentration in her small face. He turned back toward the board, pretending not to notice. Lila did not know the words modular arithmetic or prime density. She had never heard of Euler, Hardy, or Hilbert. She did not need those names. Numbers were not strangers to her. They were companions in the cold evenings when May coughed through the night, and the heater clanked but gave no warmth. She would sit by the rickety table, tracing circles on scraps of paper, imagining each number as a note in a lullaby. Now, standing before Harvard Yard, she felt the same music rising again. Her chalk flowers were fragile, smudged by footsteps and breeze, but their rhythm was steady. The crowd applauded inside the gates. The professor had finished his demonstration, leaving the board crowded with symbols but no solution. Lila looked up, her eyes bright with wonder, and in that moment Adrian Miller knew he had witnessed something rare. He could not name it, not yet, but he felt as if he had glimpsed a hidden pattern, a quiet song that had slipped past the ears of scholars for centuries. The morning ended as quietly as it had begun. The crowd dispersed, carrying their conversations away like autumn leaves. Lila stood for a while longer, staring at the chalk stains on her hands, then gathered her paper flowers and turned toward the narrow streets of Cambridge. She did not know that the small circle she had drawn on the ground, a circle no one had asked for, a circle no one believed mattered, would soon echo far beyond the gates that had kept her out. The rain that night had left Cambridge streets glistening, as if the city itself had been polished by sorrow. Puddles reflected the lamplight, long yellow streaks trembling with each step of a passerby. It was late, and most students had hurried back to the safety of their dorms, carrying books pressed tight against their coats. Yet in a narrow alley off Massachusetts Avenue, behind a bakery that smelled faintly of stale bread, a single lamp still burned. Inside the loft above, the air was cold. The furnace had not run for weeks, its silence heavier than any noise. The windows rattled in the draft. On a thin mattress, May Thompson coughed with a sound that seemed to claw at her chest. Each spasm bent her small frame forward, leaving her pale and trembling. A hand pressed against her ribs. Beside her, Lila sat with both hands gripping the quilt, as if she could hold her grandmother's breath in place. The bouquet of paper daisies she had failed to sell today rested in a tin can on the table, their colors dulled by the dim light. "Don't worry, Grandma," Lila whispered. Her voice was soft but certain. I'll sell more tomorrow. Enough for coal, enough for soup. May turned her head and managed to smile. Her hair, once thick and silver, now fell in thinning strands against her cheek. "You're a child, Lila," she rasped. "Children shouldn't worry about soup and coal. They should dream." "I do dream," Lila answered quickly. She looked at the chalk-dusted scrap of paper beside her, circles and numbers sketched in shaky lines. "I dream about numbers that dance like petals. That's my dream." May's eyes softened. She closed them, letting her head sink back against the pillow. "Then keep dreaming, little one. Dreams are warmer than blankets." But when her breathing steadied and sleep finally came, Lila sat awake, staring at the ceiling beams. The loft creaked as the wind pressed against it, and she thought of Harvard Yard, of the blackboard crowded with chalk, of the guard's voice telling her she could not enter. She thought of the circle she had drawn, the strange calm that had filled her when she whispered to herself about 38 and 31 and 7. It was as if she had uncovered a secret rhythm that belonged to her alone. That same evening, in a dormitory not far away, Adrian Miller sat at his desk, replaying the photograph on his phone. The chalk circle on the stone pavement was grainy in the picture, but the numbers were clear. 38, equaling 31 plus 7. The digits were written in a child's hand, uneven, but their placement suggested something deliberate. Around them, faint arcs curved into petals, almost like a flower radiating from a center. Adrian frowned. He had seen countless sketches, countless failed approaches to Goldbach's conjecture. Most were dry, heavy with equations that promised more than they could deliver. But this was not mathematics in the formal sense. It was something raw, untrained, almost innocent. And yet he could not dismiss it. There was an intuition hidden there, a shape behind the numbers, as if someone had glimpsed a doorway he had only suspected. He leaned back in his chair, remembering the small figure clutching paper flowers outside the gate. He had assumed she was just another child from the city, selling trinkets, passing time. But the look in her eyes when she drew the circle, that was not the look of a child at play. It was focus, quiet, and burning. Adrian's training warned him to be skeptical. Mathematics did not bend to intuition alone. It demanded rigor, proof, the scaffolding of logic. Yet every great leap in history had begun with an intuition that seemed absurd. Newton seeing an apple fall, Ramanujan dreaming of formulas. Why not a little girl sketching flowers out of primes? He saved the photo carefully in a folder labeled Flower Spiral. Then he closed his laptop and sat in the silence, his heart unsteady. He could not yet name what he felt. Awe, hope, or fear that the world would crush such a fragile spark before it had a chance to glow. The next morning, Cambridge bustled as always. Bicycles clattered across bricks, voices rose from coffee shops, and the yard filled once again with the rustle of coats and notebooks. For most, life went on untouched by mystery. But for Lila, the day was marked by hunger and the weight of duty. She woke early, folded more flowers from scraps of colored paper, and tied them with bits of string she had scavenged from old packages. Her hands moved quickly, deftly. She had learned that if the folds were sharp and precise, people were more likely to stop, to smile, to buy. May's cough was worse that morning. She urged Lila to stay, to fetch water, to rest beside her. But Lila shook her head with gentle determination. "I'll sell them all today," she promised. "And tonight, we'll eat something hot." The streets were cold. Lila's shoes were worn thin, her jacket patched in 3 places. But her eyes held the same quiet fire as before. She stood at the corner near Harvard Square, lifting the bouquet toward each passerby. Some glanced at her and hurried on. Others smiled apologetically, too busy, too burdened. A few paused long enough to buy a flower, dropping coins into her small hand. By midday, her fingers were stiff, her stomach empty. She sat on the stone steps of a bookstore, counting her coins, when she heard a voice. "You were at the yard yesterday." She looked up. Adrian stood above her, the same leather satchel slung over his shoulder. His hair was unkempt from a sleepless night. He looked at her not as one looks at a street child, but as one looks at a fellow traveler. Lila said nothing. She held the bouquet tighter, wary. "I saw what you drew," Adrian continued. "On the stone. The circle. The numbers." Her eyes widened, just a fraction. "It was only a game," she murmured. "No," Adrian said softly. He crouched to meet her gaze. "It was more than a game." Lila studied him. His voice held no mockery, no condescension, only a kind of wonder. She wanted to believe him. But belief was dangerous. Belief could lead to disappointment. Still, she whispered, "Numbers? They bloom like flowers if you listen. Every even number has a pair. Each pair is a petal, and they all turn back to the center." Adrian felt his chest tighten. It was nonsense in one sense, poetry in another. Yet hidden in her words was a vision, a geometry no textbook had ever drawn. He wanted to press further, to ask her to explain, to show him. But he saw the exhaustion in her face, the shadows under her eyes, the small trembling in her hands. This was not the time. Instead, he reached into his pocket and placed a folded bill into her palm. "For the flowers," he said. "All of them." Lila blinked. She looked down at the money, more than she had ever held at once. Slowly, she offered the bouquet. Adrian shook his head. "Keep them." "You'll sell them again. Just promise me—" His voice faltered, but he steadied it. "Promise me you'll keep drawing your circles." For a moment, neither moved. Then Lila nodded. A faint smile touched her lips, fragile but real. That evening, when she returned to the loft with food in her arms, May wept softly, not from hunger, but from relief. They ate in silence, bread dipped in thin soup, and afterward Lila took out the broken stub of chalk she had hidden in her pocket. On the floor beside her mattress, she drew once more, circle after circle, primes paired into petals, petals into spirals. Outside, the wind rattled the windows. Inside, the faint scratch of chalk filled the room with music. And across the city, in a dorm room lit by a single lamp, Adrian stared again at the photo on his phone. He did not know what destiny had just stepped into his life, but he knew this much. Harvard had overlooked something extraordinary, and he, at least, would not let it slip away. The moon over Cambridge was pale, a thin coin drifting through clouds. The streets around Harvard had grown silent, save for the faint hum of distant traffic and the hollow echo of footsteps on stone. Most of the yard lay in shadow, the windows of the dormitories dark. But one building, Seaver Hall, loomed like a sentinel, its Romanesque arches carved deep with history. Its doors were closed for the night, or almost closed. Adrian Miller paused at the entrance, glancing over his shoulder. The guard's rounds had passed minutes earlier. He eased the heavy door open, the hinges groaning softly, and motioned for Lila to follow. She hesitated, clutching her paper flowers to her chest. The world beyond those doors was forbidden, hallowed, but curiosity glowed stronger than fear. She stepped inside. The corridor was long, lined with portraits whose eyes seemed to follow intruders. Their frames caught the moonlight that seeped through high windows, turning the hall into a gallery of shadows. The smell of chalk and old wood clung to the air. For Adrian, the building was familiar. For Lila, It was another universe. They reached the lecture room. Adrian pushed the door open, and there, in the stillness, the great blackboard waited. It stretched across the wall like a field of night, empty, untouched. The desks stood in rows like silent witnesses. Above, a single skylight admitted the silver glow of the moon. Adrian handed her a piece of chalk. "Go on," he whispered. Lila stood before the board, the chalk trembling in her fingers. For a long moment she did not move. Then she reached up and began to draw. At first it was a circle, then another, larger, around it. She placed even numbers along the edge, careful, deliberate, and for each she searched for the primes that paired together. Thin white lines arched across the circle, joining them like threads. Petals formed, one after another, spiraling outward. Adrian watched, entranced. The design was no longer a child's doodle on stone. Here, on the wide board beneath moonlight, it came alive. A great flower unfurled, its symmetry uncanny. The outer rim shone with even numbers. The inner arcs, fragile yet precise, joined pairs of primes like veins in a leaf. Lila stepped back, her face lifted toward the light. "They always return," she murmured. "No matter how far the numbers grow, the petals bend back to the center, like they're listening." Adrian swallowed hard. He had studied number theory for years, endured lectures filled with rigor and abstraction, but he had never felt it, never truly seen beauty drawn so simply. There was something in her vision, something beyond equations. He could almost believe that the old conjecture might yield not to brute force, but to patience, to listening. Then a sound broke the stillness. A sharp click. The door. Adrian turned. Standing in the threshold was Professor Edwin Whitford. His tall frame filled the space, his suit immaculate despite the hour. His face, lit by the slant of moonlight, was carved in stern lines. He was chair of the mathematics department, guardian of its reputation, a man known for precision and pride. His eyes fixed on the board. "What is this?" His voice was low, edged with disdain. He stepped closer, the sound of his shoes striking the floor like a gavel. "Who brought a child into Sever Hall at this hour?" Adrian moved instinctively in front of Lila. "Professor, wait! Look at what she's done." "I see what she's done," Whitford snapped. He approached the blackboard, studying the spirals with narrowed eyes. "Nonsense! Chalk and whimsy. This is not mathematics. This is scribbling." "It's more than that," Adrian insisted. "She's pairing primes, mapping them on a circle. Look at the pattern." Whitford raised a hand, silencing him. He reached for the chalk resting on the sill and with two decisive strokes dragged white scars across the board. The petals vanished under his hand, whole arcs shattered. Dust rained down, filling the air. Lila gasped. She had not spoken until now, but the sight of her work erased so swiftly struck her like a blow. She clutched her flowers, knuckles white, her eyes wide with something between fear and sorrow. Whitford let the chalk fall. It struck the tray with a dull snap. He turned toward Adrian, his voice colder. "Do not waste the time of this institution with children's drawings. Harvard does not chase mirages. And you," his gaze lingered, sharp as glass, "should know better." Adrian's heart pounded. He wanted to shout, to defend her, but the authority in Whitford's presence weighed heavy. Centuries of tradition seemed to stand at his side. Words dried in Adrian's throat. Whitford gave one last glance at Lila, dismissive, as one looks at a trespasser who does not belong, then walked from the room. The echo of his steps faded into silence. For a long while neither spoke. The blackboard stood blank again, a void where moments earlier a garden had bloomed. Chalk dust drifted like snowflakes in the air. Finally, Adrian turned. Lila's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but her lips were pressed tight. She would not cry before him. She bent down, picked up the fallen chalk, and slipped it into her pocket. Then, without a word, she turned to leave. Adrian followed, guilt gnawing at him. He had brought her here, believing she would be seen, recognized. Instead, she had been dismissed, erased, as if she were nothing. Outside, the night was colder. The moon hid behind clouds, and the yard was empty. Lila walked ahead, her small figure swallowed by the shadows of elm trees. Adrian watched her, struck by the quiet dignity in her steps. She did not run, she did not plead. She simply carried her flowers and the broken chalk as though both were still worth keeping. In that moment, Adrian understood. Genius was not always met with applause. More often it was met with silence, even scorn. The world did not know how to see it when it came in unexpected forms. But he had seen. He could not unsee. As they left Harvard Yard, the bells of Memorial Church tolled midnight. Each note fell heavy in the air, marking the close of a day, the close of a dream. Yet somewhere within that sound, faint but unbroken, Adrian thought he heard another rhythm. The quiet scratch of chalk, the whisper of petals spiraling back to their center. The morning after their secret in Sever Hall, Harvard Yard looked no different. Students hurried with coffee cups, professors carried stacks of papers, and the elm leaves shivered in the autumn wind. The great engines of learning turned as always, unshaken by the small dramas that unfolded in its shadow. But for Adrian Miller, the air felt heavier, as though the very bricks of the university were pressing on his chest. He had barely slept. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the flower spirals vanish beneath Whitford's sweeping hand, the chalk breaking, the dust falling like snow. And each time, he saw the silence in Lila's face, the way she swallowed her hurt with dignity far too old for a child. Adrian knew Whitford's word carried weight. In the eyes of the department, the matter was settled. A child's drawings could never be mathematics. Yet Adrian could not let it rest. He had seen the pattern with his own eyes, felt the pulse in its symmetry. It was not proof. No. But it was not nothing. That morning, he climbed the worn steps of the IT office, tucked behind Widener Library. Inside, the hum of machines filled the room, along with the stale scent of old coffee. A student worker looked up from behind a desk, adjusting his glasses. "I need access to the lecture hall recordings," Adrian said, his voice steady though his heart raced. "Sever Hall, last night." The student raised a brow. "That's unusual. Those aren't for release without authorization." Adrian leaned forward. "It's important. Please. Just the security feed." The student hesitated, then shrugged. "Your name's on the research roster. Fine." He typed a few commands, and soon a screen flickered with grainy footage. The camera overlooked the lecture hall, capturing the board, the moonlight, and the small figure with chalk in hand. Adrian's breath caught. There it was, Lila's spiral unfolding, petal after petal. The circle widened, numbers glimmered in white arcs, the design blooming into something strangely alive. And there was Whitford, stepping in, his face cold, his hand sweeping it all away. Adrian clenched his fists. He copied the footage onto a drive, thanked the worker, and hurried out. That night, in his dormitory, he sat before his laptop. He edited the video carefully, trimming silence, adjusting brightness so that each chalk line stood sharp against the blackboard. He slowed the sequence, frame by frame, so the petals appeared one after another, unfolding like time-lapse blossoms. When he finished, he stared at the title box. What name should he give it? He thought of her paper daisies, fragile yet luminous in her hands. He typed slowly, "Flower Spiral." With trembling fingers, he sent the file across the ocean to a mathematician he admired in Paris, a man who had once lectured on prime structures with such beauty that Adrian had wept. Surely, he thought, someone who believed in beauty could see what he had seen. The reply came 3 days later. It was brief, formal, polite. Thank you for the submission. While intriguing, the work lacks rigor. Without clear definition or proof, we cannot consider it mathematics. Adrian closed his laptop with a dull snap. His chest ached. He had expected skepticism, perhaps dismissal, but seeing it in writing crushed the last fragile hope he carried. And yet, tucked at the bottom of the email, there was something else. A single line, written almost like an afterthought. Still, check the modular structure. There may be something there. Adrian read the sentence again and again. Check the modular structure. It was not an endorsement. It was not recognition. But it was not nothing. It was the faintest acknowledgement that perhaps, just perhaps, the child's spirals contained a shadow of truth. Meanwhile, in the loft above the bakery, life grew harder. May's cough deepened, rattling her chest. The coins Lila brought home bought little more than bread and broth. The furnace remained cold. At night, Lila wrapped herself in her grandmother's arms, listening to the wheeze of her breathing, and wondered how long dreams could last against hunger. She had not spoken of Sever Hall. She carried the broken chalk in her pocket, touching it sometimes like a talisman, but she no longer drew her circles in public. The memory of Whitford's hand erasing her work lingered too sharply. She folded flowers instead, paper petals stacking one upon another, each one quieter than the last. Adrian visited once, bringing groceries. He found her at the table, her small hands busy with folds, the air filled with the faint sound of May's coughing. He wanted to tell her of the video, of the reply from Paris, of the single line that still flickered with possibility. But he stopped himself. The words felt fragile, and he feared to offer hope where there might be none. Still, he left that evening with the image of her bent over the paper, her eyes distant, as though the numbers still whispered inside her, though she no longer dared to draw them. Harvard, meanwhile, remained unmoved. Whitford continued his lectures, his authority unchallenged. To most, the incident had never occurred. The yard filled with students each morning, the blackboards once again covered with formulas and proofs, the cycles of scholarship turning as predictably as the seasons. But the camera had not taken sides. It had not judged. It had only recorded. And within its grainy frames lay a truth that no erasing hand could undo. A child, under moonlight, had drawn a vision of numbers that had made even a weary graduate student believe again. Adrian knew the battle ahead would be harder than any equation. The challenge was not to prove the conjecture, that was a task for generations, but to protect the spark that had dared to imagine it differently. He opened his laptop once more, replayed the spiral blooming on screen, and whispered to himself, "Don't let it be erased again." The storm arrived with little warning. Clouds pressed low over Cambridge, bruised and heavy, until the first drops struck the cobblestones like scattered coins. By dusk, rain was sweeping in sheets across the rooftops, drumming against windows, drowning the hum of the city in its relentless voice. In the loft above the bakery, the water seeped through cracks in the old walls. May sat propped against pillows, coughing harder than ever, her breath shallow, her lips pale. The single lamp sputtered against the draft. On the table lay a pile of unsold paper daisies, limp and curling in the damp air. A knock rattled the door. It was the landlord, his hat dripping, his coat smelling of wet wool. His voice was blunt, stripped of sympathy. "Rent's overdue. I've given you weeks. Tomorrow you'll need to clear out." Lila stood frozen, the words slashing through her like cold wind. May tried to protest, her frail voice breaking into coughs, but the man only shrugged. "I'm sorry. Business is business." Then he was gone, leaving muddy footprints on the stairs. Silence filled the loft, broken only by the storm. Lila turned to her grandmother. May reached for her hand, squeezing with what little strength she had. "It's not your fault, child," she whispered. "We'll find a way." But Lila saw the truth in her eyes. There was no money left, no more favors to call upon. The storm outside was not only of rain, it was the storm of losing the only shelter they had. That night, while May drifted into fitful sleep, Lila packed quietly. A few clothes, the tin can of flowers, the chalk stub she had carried since Sever Hall. She moved like a shadow, her heart pounding, every rustle of paper sounding too loud. At last, she stood by the window staring at the yard in the distance, where the lamps glowed faint through the rain. She whispered to herself, "Petals find their center." Meanwhile, in a dorm across campus, Adrian Miller sat at his desk, the storm battering the windows. He had replayed the video again and again until the spiral etched itself into his mind. Each arc seemed to breathe, each pair of primes folding inward, as though the numbers themselves longed for a home. He was about to close his laptop when a notification pinged. A new message, anonymous. He opened it and found a single image, a page covered in hand-drawn spirals, more intricate than before. Lines bent gracefully, weaving with a rhythm almost musical. Beneath it, in shaky letters, were the words, "Petals find their center." His pulse quickened. It had to be Lila. But how had she sent it? And from where? He grabbed his coat and ran into the rain, driven by instinct. The bakery was only a few blocks away. By the time he reached the alley, water soaked through his shoes, his hair plastered to his forehead. He climbed the steps 2 at a time and knocked. No answer. He knocked again, harder. Still nothing. Finally, he pushed the door open. The loft was empty, the mattress bare, the table cleared. Only one thing remained. A single sheet of paper, damp at the edges, lying in the middle of the floor. He bent to pick it up. The page showed a spiral beginning at the number 4 and winding outward through 100. The arcs formed a flower with dozens of petals, each line connecting primes like threads of silver. And at the bottom, in letters that wavered but held firm, was the phrase he had already seen, "Petals find their center." Adrian's throat tightened. The storm roared louder, as if the city itself were grieving. He stood alone in the empty room, clutching the paper as though it were the last trace of her. Across town, beneath the relentless rain, Lila led May down the darkened streets. The older woman leaned heavily on her, her breaths shallow, each step an effort. Lila's small frame trembled under the weight, but she did not falter. They found shelter beneath the awning of an abandoned shop. The rain still reached them in cold sprays, but it was better than nothing. May sank against the wall, eyes closed, her lips murmuring fragments of prayers. Lila held the chalk stub in her hand. On the wet pavement she tried to draw, but the rain blurred each line as soon as it was made. Still, she traced the arcs, whispering numbers under her breath, as if the act itself might summon warmth, might anchor them against the storm. For her, the spiral had become more than play, more than vision. It was hope. If even numbers could always find partners, if every petal bent back to a center, then perhaps she and May would not be lost forever. But as the night deepened and the rain showed no mercy, that hope felt fragile. Adrian did not sleep. He searched the streets until dawn, his heart pounding with each shadow that might be them. The city seemed endless, its alleys countless, the storm washing away every trace. By sunrise, he returned to his dorm exhausted, soaked, clutching the spiral page like a lifeline. He spread it across his desk. Despite the water stains, the design remained clear. He began to trace it with his finger, following the arcs, noting the rhythm. Something stirred in his mind, the phrase from Paris, "Check the modular structure." Could it be? Could her spirals conceal a framework he had not yet seen? He pulled out a notebook and began sketching, his pencil racing. He worked until his hands cramped, his mind alive with both urgency and grief. He could not find her, but he could honor what she had left behind. And so, while the storm cleared and the sun rose over Cambridge, the city began to forget. Students hurried again, professors lectured again, the yard filled with its usual voices. To the world, nothing had changed. But in one loft, now empty, a faint trace of chalk still marked the floor. And in one dorm, a young scholar bent over a page, chasing the echo of a child's vision. Lila and May were gone, swallowed by the storm. Only a single line remained, like a prayer left behind. Petals find their center. The storm passed, but it left a city unsettled. Puddles lingered in the gutters, reflecting the pale sky. The elms of Harvard Yard dripped steadily, their branches like weary arms. To most, the morning was ordinary again. Lectures to attend, books to carry, the steady pulse of academic life resuming. But beneath that calm, something restless stirred. It began online. Adrian, unable to keep Lila's spirals to himself, uploaded the edited video. He hesitated before pressing send, his finger hovering over the trackpad. But the image of the empty loft, the damp spiral left behind, hardened his resolve. He gave the file a simple title: The Flower Spiral. The clip was short. A child at the blackboard under moonlight, drawing arcs with small, deliberate strokes. Even numbers around a circle, prime pairs connected like petals, a spiral blooming, fragile yet hypnotic. And then the interruption. The door opening, Professor Whitford stepping in, his face sharp with authority. 2 swift sweeps of his hand, the chalk falling, the flower erased. Within hours, the video spread beyond his control. Mathematicians debated it on forums. Philosophers quoted it on blogs. Strangers retweeted it with captions ranging from awe to ridicule. Genius or nonsense? The headlines asked. Some dismissed it outright. Child's play, one professor wrote, no different from doodles in a margin. Another called it a dangerous romanticization of intuition, divorced from proof. But others lingered on the image. A retired number theorist in California typed slowly, "There is something haunting in the symmetry." Perhaps not mathematics as we know it, but an intuition worth listening to. Artists began sharing still frames of the spiral, tracing its arcs in watercolor and ink. A composer in Berlin set the numbers to a sequence of notes, releasing a piece he called Petals Return to Center. The comments flooded in. It feels like listening to infinity. Then came the leak. Someone within the university, Adrian never learned who, released the raw footage from the security camera. No edits, no captions. The video showed Whitford entering Seaver Hall, his figure stark against the moonlight. It showed the chalk flower blooming petal by petal, and it showed him erasing it all, his hand sweeping with finality, his expression cold. The internet caught fire. Harvard erases street child's mathematics, one headline blared. Genius or fraud? Did the university bury the answer to Goldbach? Another asked. Talk shows debated the clip, anchors leaning forward with practiced solemnity. Some mocked it, calling it a fairy tale for desperate times. But others were incensed. Why, they asked, would a professor silence a child before even listening? Emails flooded the department inboxes. Protests sprang up outside the yard, students chalking spirals across the stones, drawing pairs of numbers joined like petals. They called themselves the Listening Circle. Adrian watched it all unfold with disbelief. He had not expected this. He had wanted only to preserve a vision, not to ignite a storm. Yet the storm had come, fierce and unrelenting. Professor Whitford bore the brunt of it. He walked the yard each day with his usual rigid stride, but the whispers followed him. Reporters lingered near the gates, cameras flashing. Former colleagues from Europe sent curt messages, some defending him, most demanding explanation. In the faculty lounge, conversations hushed when he entered. One evening, he addressed the department in a meeting that smelled of coffee and tension. His voice was clipped. "We cannot allow ourselves to be mocked by spectacle. The child's drawing is irrelevant. It holds no structure, no proof. Mathematics is not art. It is discipline." Yet even as he spoke, his hand trembled slightly against the table. Perhaps he remembered the chalk dust falling like snow. Perhaps he wondered late at night whether he had indeed erased something he did not understand. In the loft where Lila once lived, another tenant had already moved in. The bakery owner shrugged when asked about her. "They left in the storm," he said. "I don't know where." But her absence only deepened the myth. Online forums filled with speculation. Who was the flower girl? Was she real, or a fabrication to shame the university? Some claimed to have seen her selling paper flowers near Harvard Square. Others insisted she had vanished into the streets of Boston. The mystery fed the frenzy. Adrian remained silent. He did not post, did not argue. He spent his nights hunched over the spiral she had left, tracing its arcs, comparing it against modular forms, prime densities, known theorems. Most paths led nowhere. Yet sometimes at 3 a.m. he glimpsed patterns that made his breath catch. Ratios that repeated. Gaps that echoed Fibonacci's rhythm. Whispers of structure beneath the flower's fragile beauty. He kept searching. For her, and for the truth. One afternoon, as he crossed the yard, a student stopped him. She was kneeling on the stones, chalk in hand, drawing circles that overlapped like ripples. She looked up and said simply, "Do you think she was real?" Adrian wanted to answer. He wanted to tell her about the small hand gripping chalk, the whisper of 38 becoming 31 plus 7. He wanted to say, "Yes, she was real. She is more real than all of us." But the words caught in his throat. He only nodded and kept walking. Above him, the sky was turning gray again. Another storm brewing. Not of rain, but of voices, questions, accusations. The kind of storm that no university, no professor, no scholar could fully control. And at the heart of it all was a child, unseen, unheard, carrying paper flowers through the streets. The public had begun to ask, was Harvard protecting truth or hiding from it? Was the flower spiral folly, or the first step toward an answer humanity had sought for centuries? Adrian knew one thing. Whatever the world decided, the spiral was no longer his secret. It belonged now to everyone, to skeptics and dreamers alike. And somewhere, perhaps watching from the shadows of the city, Lila herself must know. Her petals had been erased once, but this time the chalk lines would not be so easily wiped away. The uproar had not faded. It had only shifted, deepened, taken root in corners Adrian never expected. Professors still debated. Students still chalked spirals across the yard. But for Adrian, the storm outside mattered less than the silence within. Lila was still gone, and her absence left a hollow that no news article could fill. One gray morning, as he left his dormitory at Kirkland House, He found something waiting. A plain brown envelope, weather-stained, slid under the door. No return address. No name. Only his, written in uneven letters. His hands shook as he picked it up. He tore it open, expecting perhaps a note from a student or another demand from the press. Instead, 6 sheets of paper fell onto his desk. They were covered in spirals. Not the first simple circles he had seen from Lila, but more elaborate, more daring. Numbers wound outward in arcs, primes paired into petals, petals bending into larger whorls. On one page, the arcs followed a rhythm unmistakable. 3, 5, 8, 13. Fibonacci's ancient sequence, the same pattern that guided the growth of shells and sunflowers. On another, the gaps between primes curved outward like ribs, radiating from a hidden center. Across the margins, written in the same childlike hand, were small notes. The farthest petal is the one that remembers. Listen to the space between numbers, not only the numbers. Every spiral finds its home. Adrian sat frozen. His chest tightened with something between awe and grief. She was alive. Somewhere, somehow, she had sent this to him. And more than that, the drawings were not random. They hinted at structure. The Fibonacci rhythm was no accident. It was an invitation, a thread to follow. He spread the pages across his desk, covering the surface until it looked like a garden had blossomed there. He bent over them, his pen racing. Modular forms, prime gaps, ratios repeating in patterns too subtle to dismiss. Each page whispered of connections half buried, waiting for the right language to bring them into the open. But he could not do this alone. That evening, he sought out 2 junior professors he trusted, young enough not to be jaded, curious enough to risk their reputations. He invited them to his cramped dorm room, cleared the books from his bed, and spread the spiral pages across the floor. At first, they laughed. One muttered, "It looks like art class." But then silence fell. Their eyes traced the arcs, the numbers, the Fibonacci rhythm hiding in plain sight. One knelt, pointing at the pattern. "If this density holds," he broke off, biting his lip. "It predicts distribution, not precisely, but it gestures at it, almost like probability blooming into shape." The other professor whispered, "It shouldn't be possible. Yet look at it. The symmetry. The balance." They worked until dawn, pencils scratching, coffee cooling untouched. By the end of the night, their laughter had vanished, replaced by something more dangerous. Belief. News of their midnight gatherings spread quietly. A retired number theorist living in Arlington heard whispers and asked to join. His hair was white, his hands arthritic, but his mind was sharp as ever. When he saw the spirals, his eyes filled with tears. "I spent 40 years chasing these gaps," he said hoarsely, "and here a child has sketched them like flowers." They called themselves nothing, signed no papers, published no claims. But night after night, in Adrian's small room or in borrowed corners of libraries, they gathered around the spirals, listening. They argued, scribbled, calculated. Sometimes they disagreed violently, voices rising until they remembered themselves and lowered their tones again. But always they returned to the pages, to the soft curves that seemed to breathe. One night the retired scholar leaned back, his hands trembling. "Do you realize," he whispered, "what this could mean? If her intuition is right, if these spirals can predict prime density, then we are standing at the edge of something no one has ever touched." Silence followed. None dared to speak it aloud, but the thought was there. A child's doodles might have opened a door to Goldbach's fortress. Meanwhile, the world outside clamored louder. Protests flared again, journalists hounded Whitford, and Harvard itself reeled beneath scrutiny. Committees met, statements were drafted, but none of it calmed the frenzy. The myth of the flower girl only grew. Adrian said nothing. He kept the spirals close, guarding them like embers. The brown envelope never left his desk. Each time he looked at it, he imagined her slipping it into a mailbox with trembling hands, her heart racing, hoping it would reach him. Where was she now? Was she safe? Was May still with her? These questions haunted him even as the spirals consumed his waking hours. He would catch himself staring at the Fibonacci arcs, whispering the numbers aloud like a prayer. 3, 5, 8, 13, 21. Each step a rhythm older than memory, and now, perhaps, a bridge between intuition and proof. One night, long after the others had gone, Adrian sat alone. The lamp burned low, his eyes stung with exhaustion, yet he could not stop. He traced the petals outward, the Fibonacci sequence curving again and again, wrapping primes into patterns no one had charted. And for a fleeting moment he felt it. That shiver mathematicians live for, the whisper that a mystery is not impenetrable, only waiting for the right touch. He closed his eyes, seeing Lila's small hand gripping chalk, her whisper, "They always return." When he opened them again, his notebook was filled with equations half-formed, arrows pointing toward something he could not yet name. He leaned back, breathless. "Lila," he whispered into the empty room. "We're listening." The yard in spring was alive again. Buds pushed against branches, green against the old red brick, and the air smelled of rain not yet fallen. But within the faculty chamber of University Hall, the atmosphere was brittle, a silence heavy with judgment. The Harvard Council had been called. Reporters thronged outside the gates, their cameras waiting. Professors whispered in corridors. Students clustered on steps, the whole university quivering under the weight of a single question. What had truly happened that night in Savor Hall? Inside, the chamber was wood-paneled and solemn, portraits of past presidents gazing down like silent jurors. At the center of the long table sat Professor Edwin Whitford, his suit pressed, his tie immaculate. His face was pale, lined deeper than usual, as if sleepless nights had carved new shadows into it. Before him lay a folder, unopened, his hands clasped tight upon it. The chair of the council, an elder with a voice as dry as parchment, cleared his throat. "Professor Whitford, the incident with the child, the erasure of her work, the subsequent storm, it has become a matter of international scrutiny. We ask for your account." All eyes turned to him. Whitford drew a slow breath. For a moment his lips pressed into a hard line, the same line that had silenced countless students before. But then his hand moved. From his jacket pocket he pulled something small, unexpected. It was a fragment of slate, a broken piece of the blackboard, dark and worn, edges jagged. He placed it on the table with care, as though it were fragile glass. His fingers trembled as they rested on it. When he spoke, his voice was lower than usual, stripped of authority. "That night, I erased what I did not understand." A murmur rippled through the chamber. Whitford's gaze drifted upward, toward the skylight where light filtered in like a benediction. "I have taught mathematics for 30 years. I have demanded rigor, demanded clarity. I have dismissed anything less. But when I saw the chalk lines drawn by that child..." His voice faltered. He pressed his hands together. "I felt something I could not name. And so, fearing it was folly, I swept it away. I told myself I was protecting the discipline. But in truth, I was protecting my pride." The silence that followed was complete. Even the clock on the wall seemed to hesitate. At last the chair spoke again, his voice gentler now. "Professor, You understand that the world is asking whether Harvard silenced a prodigy. Whitford's eyes dropped to the shard of slate. Yes, he whispered, and I fear the answer may be yes. That same afternoon, in Adrian's dormitory, an envelope arrived from Paris. The postmark was faint, the seal official. His hands shook as he tore it open. Inside was a letter printed on fine cream paper. We have reviewed the additional diagrams. Though we cannot call them proof, we believe the vision behind them deserves attention. Mathematics is not only calculation, but also imagination. Please, if the child can be found, bring her. She will have a place here, not for what she has solved, but for how she sees. Adrian read the words twice, then a third time, his throat tight. Paris was listening. The door was open. But Lila, where was she? News of Whitford's confession spread quickly. The press seized upon it, headlines blazing. Harvard chair admits erasing child's work. The campus buzzed with renewed fervor. Students chalked more spirals across the yard, their curves stretching from one path to another. The listening circle grew, children from Cambridge joining, laughter echoing against the solemn brick. But to Adrian, the celebration rang hollow. The letter from Paris burned in his pocket. He wanted to run through the streets, shouting that a place awaited her, that she would not be silenced again. Yet he had no idea where she had gone, no idea how to reach her. He returned to the empty loft above the bakery, though he knew what he would find. Another family lived there now, their voices warm with ordinary life. On the floor, where once chalk had traced spirals, only worn wood remained. He walked the streets, searching faces in doorways, alleys, bus stops. Once, he thought he saw her, a small figure holding flowers at the far end of Mass Ave, but when he reached the corner, the child was gone. At night, he spread the spirals across his desk again. The Fibonacci arcs, the notes in her childish scrawl. He whispered them like prayers. The farthest petal is the one that remembers. Every spiral finds its home. Paris had asked not for proof, but for her presence. And so the question remained, sharp as hunger. Where was Lila Thompson? Back in University Hall, after the hearing had adjourned, Whitford lingered alone. He sat at the long table, the portraits gazing down, the shard of slate still resting before him. His hand traced its edge. For the first time in his long career, he felt the weight of humility press harder than pride. He remembered her small frame in the moonlight, the whisper of her chalk, the way her eyes had shone not with arrogance, but with wonder. He closed his eyes, and for a fleeting moment, he wished he could stand again in Sever Hall and watch, not erase. But time did not turn backward, only forward, spiraling, always toward the center. Outside, the yard filled with chalk once more. Spirals bloomed along the stones, not erased this time, but multiplied, each petal drawn by a hand that believed, even faintly, in beauty. And somewhere, hidden from the crowd, a girl with paper daisies pressed her face against the cool glass of a bus window. The city rolled past in blurred colors. She held the chalk stub in her palm and whispered to herself, "They'll listen one day." The bus rumbled on. Spring crept gently into Cambridge. The snow had melted, leaving the yard soft with grass. The elms, still bare weeks ago, now stretched pale green fingers toward the sky. Birds darted between branches, and the cobblestones shone warm in the afternoon sun. The students called it the listening ring. It had begun as a protest, an act of defiance against erasure. But by now it was something else, something quieter. A wide circle of wooden benches stood in the yard, built by volunteers from rough planks. Within it, the stones had been left bare, an open canvas. Each day, students came with chalk to draw spirals, arcs, petals. Children from the neighborhood joined, their laughter mingling with the scratch of chalk. Professors, some skeptical, some curious, came too, sitting in the ring to watch, sometimes to add a line of their own. The air was filled with colors, not only white chalk now, but pink, blue, yellow. Even numbers danced along the edges of circles, primes joined in arcs, Fibonacci curves curling into whorls. It was not proof, no, but it was something harder to dismiss. Beauty shared. Adrian walked among them often, carrying a notebook but rarely writing. He would stand at the edge, watching the spirals bloom. He thought of Lila with every line, every curve. He imagined her small hand drawing, her whisper of petals finding their center. He wondered if she knew that her vision had seeded a garden. And then, one morning, he saw her. She was smaller than he remembered, or perhaps it was that the circle made everyone equal, stripped of titles and robes. She stood at the far side of the ring, clutching a single paper daisy. Her jacket was too thin for the spring chill, her hair tangled by the wind. Yet her eyes were the same, wide, luminous, steady. Adrian's breath caught. He did not move at first, afraid the vision would vanish, but she stepped forward, her shoes scuffing softly on stone, and entered the ring. The crowd noticed her slowly. A hush spread like ripples on water. The students laid down their chalk, children stilled. Even the professors fell silent. Lila walked to the center and knelt. She placed the paper daisy on the stone. Then she picked up a stick of chalk. For a moment she only held it, staring at the blank space before her. Then she drew. A circle first, careful, unbroken. Around it she marked even numbers, 38, 46, 52. She paused, then began to join them with arcs, primes folding into pairs. Petals unfurled. Another circle, larger, and more petals joined. The spiral grew outward, blooming under the spring sun. Whispers rose in the ring, but no one interrupted. It was as if the yard itself was listening. At the edge, Professor Whitford stood, his tall frame stooped with age that seemed heavier now. He clutched a stick of chalk in his hand, his knuckles white. His face was pale, but his eyes, those eyes that once dismissed so easily, now shone with something raw. He stepped forward, hesitating, as though every inch of stone burned beneath his feet. The students parted to let him pass. He stopped at the edge of the spiral where Lila knelt. For a long moment he did not speak. Then, with hands trembling, he bent down. He marked two numbers, 59 and 41. Slowly, he drew a line between them. A petal curved into being. His lips moved, almost too soft to hear. I never knew mathematics could be this beautiful. Lila looked up. Her gaze met his, steady and quiet. She said nothing, but she did not erase his line. Instead, she drew the next petal beside it. And just like that, the ring was no longer about protest or scandal or even conjecture. It was about listening. The day lingered long in memory. Children ran across the yard, their chalk-stained hands bright with color. Students traced spirals that wound into infinity. Professors sat on the benches, not lecturing but watching, some smiling through tears they could not explain. Adrian sat at the far edge, his heart full. He did not need to speak to her then. It was enough to see her safe, to see her vision alive in the hands of many. He thought of Paris's letter tucked away in his drawer, of the invitation that still waited. There would be time for that. For now, the spiral itself was enough. As evening fell, the chalk glowed faint under the lamplight, the spirals stretching across the stones like constellations. The yard was transformed, no longer a fortress of tradition, but a garden of petals. And in the center, where the paper daisy rested, the silence was deep, not empty but full of listening. The announcement came quietly, almost as if Harvard itself were shy of admitting it. A paper had been accepted for publication, its title plain and unadorned, On Prime Spirals and Modular Intuitions. But what caught the world's breath was not the title. It was the line beneath it. Author, Lila Thompson, age 10. Affiliation, independent. For the first time, the girl at the gates was no longer anonymous, no longer erased. Her name stood beside the conjectures of centuries, not as a conqueror, but as a listener, one who had seen beauty where others saw only walls. The lecture hall filled early that afternoon, not with the pomp of academic ceremony, no polished podium, no gilded speeches, but with something gentler. Students carried benches from the yard and set them in a circle. Professors leaned against the walls, their robes folded away, their hands empty of notes. Reporters tried to crowd the doorway, but even they fell silent, sensing the air was different. At the center stood a canvas stretched across wooden frames, black as a night sky. A tray of colored chalk rested at its base. When Lila entered, she did not stride. She walked slowly, almost shyly, her paper daisies tucked under one arm. Her jacket still bore its patches, her shoes were still worn, but her eyes carried a calm that filled the hall. She placed the flowers on the floor, then turned to face the canvas. Her voice was small but steady. I don't have a proof. I don't have all the words you use, but I have something that listens. She lifted the chalk and drew. A circle first, white and clear. Around it, even numbers bloomed. She joined the primes with arcs, petals unfolding. Then, with blue chalk, she wove Fibonacci spirals, their rhythm curling through the pattern. With yellow, she added gaps stretching outward, breathing space into the design. Each stroke was slow, patient, tender, as if she were coaxing the canvas itself to listen. The room was silent, save for the whisper of chalk. Students leaned forward, eyes wide. Professors, hardened by decades of proofs, felt their throats tighten. Even Whitford, standing at the back, bowed his head, his hands clasped as if in prayer. When the last spiral closed, Lila stepped back. She set the chalk down gently. It isn't to solve, she said, her voice almost a whisper. It's to hear. Every number wants to return. Every petal bends back to the center. That's all. She lifted her hand and drew one final curve. No numbers, no pairs, only a single line that closed upon itself, a circle whole and unbroken. Then she lowered her hand. No one clapped at first. The silence was too deep, too full. But slowly, as if stirred from a dream, the room rose in applause. Not the polite clatter of academia, but a sound raw and human, like rain after drought. Some wept openly, some smiled through tears. All felt that something within them had been touched, not by proof, but by truth. Adrian sat in the circle, his heart swelling. He thought of the loft above the bakery, of May's cough, of the storm that had nearly swallowed her. He thought of the brown envelope, the spirals unfolding across his desk, and he thought of Paris's letter, still waiting. There would be journeys ahead, challenges, demands. But for this moment, it was enough to see her name written, her vision honored, her voice heard. Afterward, when the crowd had gone, Lila returned to the yard. The listening ring still stood, its stones covered in chalk blossoms from days before. Children played there, their laughter carrying in the evening air. She knelt at the center, laying one daisy among the drawings. Adrian joined her quietly. Paris still waits, he said. She nodded, her eyes on the spiral beneath her hand. One day? But first, here. He understood. She did not want to leave yet. She wanted to give back, to plant seeds where she had once stood outside the gate. Weeks later, in a small town in Nebraska where the soil cracked beneath the sun, a letter arrived. It was written in a child's hand but steady, filled with purpose. It asked for a single room in the old library, long unused, to be opened once more. By summer, the townspeople gathered. Desks were carried in, chalkboards scrubbed, windows repaired. And when the children came, they found not a stern teacher but a girl only a little older than themselves, standing with chalk in her hand. She drew a circle. She wrote an even number. She paired primes into a petal. And she said, "It isn't about being right. It's about listening." The children leaned closer. They did not understand it all, but they felt something stir. And that was enough. Back in Cambridge, the chalk spirals faded slowly under rain and footsteps. But the memory remained, carried in whispers, in stories, in the quiet conviction that beauty could be found even in the hardest problems. And in journals and archives, in libraries that smelled of dust and time, a single paper stood with its quiet line, author Lila Thompson, age 10, affiliation, independent, a name once outside the gate, now written where no hand could erase it. Thank you, my friends, for sitting with me through this story. If it brought you even a little warmth or reminded you that beauty can still be found in the quiet corners of life, then it has done its work. If you would like to walk with us again, through more tales of courage, of loss, and of hope, I invite you to stay. Simply press that button to subscribe, so when another story is ready, you will be among the first to hear it. Until then, may your days be gentle, and may your nights be filled with the kind of peace that numbers, circles, and memories can bring. Good night.